Hey everybody, welcome to Help Solve the Case. We are here doing the Delphi appeal, going over the document submitted by the defense. I'm giving you my perspective as somebody who's been in the legal system and in the criminal justice process since a heck of a long time ago. I'm not going to date myself. Thanks for being here. You're going to read along with me. Comment below. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you'd like to look at. We are doing the initial appeal here. Then we've had the state's response, and then we're going to have the rebuttal from the defense, and we've got a hearing on September 21st. So we've got a couple months on that, but let's keep going. So what we're talking about here is the defense's appeal regarding certain aspects of the case that they feel were improper, were neglected, were ignored. One of the things here is the manner, quality, and thoroughness of the investigation. Now, even though I'm a law enforcement expert, this is not a formal expert opinion. If you would like one on your case or somebody else's case, please feel free to reach out to me. I just find this very interesting. I love learning about this, and I love having you follow me because I think you might too. So what we're talking about here, this is the defense's words about what they feel was wrong with the case. We can see, do I agree? Do you agree? What do you think? What happened? Okay, so they're going to start talking about what happened in the investigation. So here's what they say. At trial, the jury heard about the state's investigation from the day the girls went missing to a few days later when Alan met with Doolin. I'm not sure who Doolin is. Let me grab my timeline here. Okay. The state then told the jury to, quote, fast forward, end quote, 5.5 years to the volunteer finding Doolin's report in September of 2022. So this seems to be this parking lot interview or whatever, this tip they call it, when it appears that Alan called in to say, hey, I was at the trail and I saw, I believe it was 3 or 4 girls, okay? 3 girls. So they're saying here, the defense says the jury heard nothing or maybe very little regarding the manner, quality, and thoroughness of the investigation between the murders in February 2017 and Alan's arrest in 2022. So that's a huge span of time. So were things missed? I'm assuming they're going to say here, what happened in between? Should the jury know that other things happened, other things should have happened? What was going on? They continue saying on November 11, 2024, following a 25-day trial, a jury found Alan guilty of 2 counts of murder. Alan appeals. Below is the evidence the defense was prohibited from offering the jury. Okay. So they're saying here, the jury did not hear about Bridge Guy. And they say the jury never saw the sketch below, which is the man Blair, witness Blair, saw on the bridge when AW and LG were approaching. They say, this is the defense, the sketch does not look like Alan, who in February 2016 was short, 44 years old, with closely cropped hair. And this would be exculpatory information, potentially other suspects that should have been looked at, right? We assume that's what they're saying. In 2017, Blair, witness Blair, rated this sketch a 10 out of 10 for accuracy, and that's huge. I mean, in the identikit, sketching likeness category from what I've seen in my cases. So that's super awesome, right? In 2019, she reaffirmed her confidence in her sketch and insisted that she could identify Bridge Guy if she saw him again. They say, nor did the jury hear that Blair, and at one point the Indiana State Police, believed the man she saw, Bridge Guy, was not the man Carbaugh saw, muddy and bloody. Now, I think what they're trying to say here, and again, if you haven't watched the other videos, I know nothing about the case. I'm just reading this document fresh Okay. And so I'm trying to understand what happened here. So I don't know anything about the case, but it sounds like maybe during the trial, they were trying to tie what witness Carbaugh said to the same person that witness Blair said, with caveats for eyewitness testimony. Okay? They're saying the bullet. The jury never heard that firearm and tool mark evidence is flawed and unscientific. Did they do a Daubert or Fry challenge? I'm not sure. Allen proffered expert witness William Tobin to explain the scientific community's criticism of the AFTE methodology. Okay. And we had talked about that in a prior video about that they were saying that there was an unspent bullet, like a bullet, in the cartridge, right, at the scene. And they compared it with fired cartridges from Allen's gun. And there were some similar marks, okay? And they talked about using this methodology. They say Tobin is a nationally recognized forensic metallurgist. Okay, so now we're going to talk about metallic properties, I believe. He has extensive experience in I don't know if it's metallurgy, I guess, bullet and lead analysis and tool mark principles, along with a background in statistics. He's familiar with the president's, President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, which has criticized the AFTE methodology of tool mark identification. Tobin reviewed Oberg's work and was prepared to explain flaws in the AFTE methodology, but they didn't get to hear it. He's testified in over 297 cases and has been recognized by state high courts as an expert on this topic. Confess motive. The jury never heard Allen's confused, disjointed ramblings and screams during the months that Dr. Walla said Allen was making logical and organized confessions. The trial court permitted Allen to play 15 videos of him in solitary to impeach his confessions, but required Allen to mute them. The excluded audio showed the following. Video 972. Guards extracted a skinny, wide-eyed Allen with blood on his forehead. Allen screamed for his, quote, dad, end quote, asked guards to hold his hands and yelled, quote, Roger, end quote, quote, Marvin, end quote, wait for it, end quote. Video 983, April 13th. Guards ordered Allen to cuff up, naked and confused. He clutched the sink and shook. When officers entered, Allen begged to be put on an airplane and told them not to believe his last confession. Video 1002, April 17th. While being transported to see Dr. Walla, another inmate yelled, quote, kill yourself, Richard Allen, end quote. Video 1007, April 17th. During a transport for a forced injection, Allen screamed, spoke incoherently, asked for his, quote, mommy, end quote, and quote, daddy, end quote, rambled about suicide and time travel, and within 7 minutes claimed to be both the stupidest and smartest person ever, and repeated, quote, wait for it, end quote. A guard told him, quote, the games are over, end quote, and commented on feces on him. Allen responded tangentially, quote, Rocky Balboa is my favorite actor, end quote. Quote, clap on, clap off, end quote. A guard noted the feces, quote, has been on him for a while, end quote. Video 1026, April 21st. During a haircut, Allen mostly stared into space. Confused, he responded, quote, leave the top, end quote, when asked if he wanted his face shaved. Video 10152, April 28th. During a shower transport, Allen spoke incoherently, repeatedly saying, quote, there is a God, end quote. Quote, please don't do this, end quote, and, quote, make it painless, end quote. With feces on his face, he asked to be euthanized and whether his wife was present. He said he was King Michael, claimed he had started World War III, tried to save his family and Donald Trump, sang hymns, quoted scripture, and asked to be cryogenically frozen. Video 1201, June 20th. Guards carried a catatonic, drooling Allen to the infirmary. The medical professional discussed with Allen his cholesterol and blood pressure rather than his non-responsiveness and involuntary jerking. Allen stared blankly when asked the date or season. Allen asked his court to watch the videos with sound, especially 172, 1002, 1007, 10152, and 1201. Also, the jury did not hear Allen, the morning he started confessing, tell his family in 3 intertwined calls that he was confused and losing his mind. In the first call at 3:12 a.m. on April 3rd, Allen told his dad he was losing his mind and was uncertain how much longer he was, quote, going to be lucid, end quote. Allen said, quote, "You guys know I would never do something like I've been accused of," end quote. Allen felt he had been mentally tortured, like he is in Guantanamo Bay, and that there were drugs in his coffee and Kool-Aid. In the call the jury heard at 5:14 a.m., Allen told his wife for the first time he thinks he killed AW and LG and, quote, "evidently did it," end quote. Allen could not remember what he told his dad in the earlier call. Then, in a third call at 8:45 a.m., a panicked Allen told his wife he was not sure if his original call to her was a dream. He said he was not drinking the water or the coffee and questioned whether the attorneys who were coming to visit him were his attorneys. The jury only heard the second call with the confession, along with Trooper Harshman's opinion that the Allen showed no, quote, indication, end quote, he was under, quote, duress or stress, end quote, when he made that admission. A detail only the killer would know. Excuse me, I'm recovering from bronchitis. The jury never heard that Allen's could not have walked the girls across the creek to kill them after seeing a van driving down a lane as he confessed. The state had videos showing Weber's van arriving home 25 minutes after the pause in movement of LG's phone and nearly 15 minutes after it stopped moving altogether. Specifically, security camera footage from Weber's neighbor showed him arriving home at around 2:44. And the state also had a report prepared by the FBI which confirmed that Weber's cell phone arrived home around 2:50 p.m. The jury also never heard that Allen confessed to details that the real killer would know were wrong, including that Allen said he shot the girls. The judge prohibited Allen's expert, Dr. Gracian, from identifying Allen's signs of being in a state of delirium and hallmarks of a false memory. One such hallmark was the facts Allen got wrong. Allen's alternative exculpatory explanation of the scene. The jury never heard that, from the beginning, many investigators believed and investigated the girls' murders as part of a Norse pagan ritual, and that the usual and complex scene had, quote, textbook, end quote, features of such. There was, quote, always a discussion, end quote, among law enforcement that this may be a ritual murder and that the sticks were Nordic runes. Also, many officers believed that the scene was too complex for just one person to be involved. Within the first week, the Carroll County Sheriff enlisted the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to evaluate whether the sticks related to, quote, pagan rituals, end quote. After examining the evidence, the BAU declined to exclude pagan ritual as a plausible explanation for the murder scene. Quote, it remains possible a new, quote, believer, end quote, or rogue believer in Odinism was involved in this case, end quote. A Purdue professor also consulted law enforcement on whether the sticks were, quote, runically inspired, end quote. He found it, quote, quite plausible, end quote, quote, these markings constitute an instruction inspired by Norse runes, or modern recreations thereof, ... end quote. Law enforcement consulted with an undercover ISP trooper regarding the sticks and the blood stain on the tree. The officer was familiar with Norse pagan symbols through his covert intelligence, and he agreed the blood on the tree resembled the pagan Fihu rune, and he found similarities between the stick formations on the girls and pagan bind runes. Once Allen was charged with the murders, the defense team consulted a nationally recognized expert, Don Perimeter, who found 7 features of a Norse pagan ritual. They include location, She explained that Norse pagans follow a Norse pantheon of gods like Thor and Odin. They have a nature-based ideology where events and rituals are conducted outdoors in wooded areas and near water bodies. This murder occurred outdoors in a clearing and near a creek. Date: Norse pagan rituals often occur on Norse holidays or events. The Nordic holiday Valesblot, which honors Odin's son Vali, begins at sundown on February 13th and continues until February 14th. The girls went missing near sundown on February 13th, and they were found the following day. Means used: ritual killings often involve a knife or ceremonial knife, and here the girls were killed with a knife that made an unusual scalloped mark. Sticks: ritualistic crimes usually involve symbolism at the scene, and with Norse pagan, the symbolism would include arranging natural objects in a specific way, like sticks and runes, and, quote, blooding the runes, end quote. These practices are integral to the, quote, magical thinking, end quote, involved in Norse paganist rituals. Here, the stick arrangement showed intentional symbolism. It's difficult to explain the sticks as hiding the bodies, quote, they are absolutely not working that way, they're not functioning that way, end quote. The stick arrangement on AW mirrored the Norse rune gebo, quote, gebo, end quote, and the intentionally placed stick formation on LG looked like a Nordic, quote, bind rune, end quote. Manner of death: ritual sacrifices often involve blood loss and torture. The girls' throats were cut and they suffered a prolonged blood loss, which is, quote, indicative of a sacrificial offering or initiation type activity, end quote. Body arrangement: in rituals, the sacrifice will be displayed or arranged at the scene in a manner that is significant to the group. And an upside-down hanging body is an important element of Norse paganism because Odin hung from a tree for 9 days before discovering the runes. Like AW's positioning, the classic image of Odin depicts him with one leg bent behind the other. Unusual blood pattern: finally, a ritual sacrifice would involve an atypical or symbolic blood pattern, and here the blood pattern on the F tree appeared to look like a Norse pagan Fihu rune. The manner, thoroughness, and quality of the investigation: the jury never heard how law enforcement bungled the investigation into the ritual killing or suspects connected to Norse paganism. ISP disregarded Brad Holder, the father of AW's boyfriend, and Holder's friend Patrick Westphal as promising alternate suspects because they lost evidence, mishandled interviews, and conducted a poor investigation. Investigation into ritual killing: after examining the scene, several officers believed the scene was too complex for just one person to be involved. When the BAU evaluated the murder scene, it found noteworthy, quote, AW was clothed, end quote. Quote, allowing AW to dress ahead of time suggests the suspect felt differently towards her, including a possibly heightened level of guilt or regret, at least compared to LG, end quote. Law enforcement explored a group of pagans connected to AW. In the weeks leading to the murders, AW had been talking with the boy LH and meeting up with him a few times. Does he look like the drawing? The Blair? Excuse me. She kept this relationship a secret from her family. On the day she was murdered, AW invited LH to meet her on the trails. LH had school, so he declined. What time does school end? 2:30? Like, what time does school end? While law enforcement was searching for the girls on February 14th, they learned about LH and AW's secret relationship, pulled LH out of class in Logansport, and searched his phone. That moment, LH texted his father, Brad Holder, quote, she's missing, end quote. Lost and missing interviews. On February 17, 2017, law enforcement interviewed both LH and Holder. By then, law enforcement already suspected the murder scene involved a pagan ritual. During this interview, Holder reported being involved in a pagan, quote, tribe, end quote, and spending, quote, every weekend, end quote, in Delphi engaging in pagan rituals with Westphal and 5 or 6 others, including women. These rituals involved animal sacrifice and human bloodletting. Holder admitted knowing about AW and LH relationship, but denied ever meeting her. Law enforcement recorded Holder's interview, but the Delphi police recorded over their only copy before August 2017, permanently deleting it. Only a one-page narrative remains. According to that narrative, Holder told police he owned a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson, but law enforcement never collected it. That's the size of the bullet at the scene, right? Nor did they collect his cell phone. I think I might have said that. On February 19, 2017, law enforcement interviewed Westfall. They failed to record this interview. Only a 5-paragraph narrative remains. According to this narrative, Westfall knew the woods where the girls were murdered, quote, very well, end quote. He reported knowing the girls, but denied ever meeting them. He also reported being a religious leader for local pagans, and he wore a necklace to the interview representing his efforts to pledge the, quote, Vinlanders, end quote, a pagan, quote, social club, end quote. There is no indication law enforcement asked Westfall whether he owned a .40 caliber firearm. Westfall's phone was not searched at that time. Alibi investigation. When asked for an alibi, Westfall claimed he was home with his minor son. Holder told the officers he was at work at Liberty Landfill. On April 13th, officers visited the landfill to investigate and spoke with an employee, Susan Case, who provided a printout showing Holder swiped out of work at 2:45 p.m., which was 30 minutes after the Bridge Guy video. Case invited the officers to review video to confirm the printout's accuracy, but they declined, nor did they interview other employees. Unified Command marked Holder as a, quote, cleared, end quote, suspect. Tipsters continue to identify Holder as the Bridge Guy. Tipsters repeatedly called and reported Holder as a person of interest. Quote, parentheses, Holder, quote, posed half-dead women and shows fascinated with ... symbols out of tree branches, end quote, and parentheses, quote, check the father of one of the girls' boyfriend, his name is Brad Holder, ... he also fits somewhat the description, end quote, and parentheses. Each time a tip came in, law enforcement marked it, quote, cleared, end quote, nothing further, end quote, covered, and, quote, end quote, or, quote, alibi confirmed, end quote. Sometime around March 2017, Detective Purdy interviewed Holder to get his assistance in connecting the murders to Norse paganism. Because Holder was not a suspect, Purdy did not record or document this interview with the report. Unified Command declines to re-interview despite reports Holder is posting pictures of, quote, young girls believed to be deceased with sticks placed over their bodies, end quote. In April 12, 2017, shortly before taking medical leave, Trooper Winters received a call from a tipster, Ryan Boucher, who shared pictures from Holder's social media. Winters found a concerning similarity between the murders and pictures posted on Holder's social media. These pictures depicted, quote, young girls believed to be deceased with stick placed over their bodies, end quote. Winters also noted similarity between the stick formation on AW and a bind rune Holder tattooed or drew on his hand. Parentheses, Holder, quote, that's a bind rune on my hand. Basically, I took a Gebo rune and an Isa rune and I made a bind rune, end quote, and parentheses. Holder's social media also featured him holding guns and, quote, homemade knives, end quote. Winters immediately recommended to his superiors that law enforcement investigate Holder further, which they declined to do, claiming his alibi was cleared by the FBI. Winters was not satisfied and urged the ISP to conduct its own investigation. No further action was taken. In 2018, Holder displayed a painting he made of Odin upside down with his right leg tucked behind his left, just like AW's legs. Holder's painting also featured a red Fihu rune. Officers continued to find other social media posting from Holder that, quote, mimicked, end quote, the crime scene, but law enforcement declined to interview Holder again. Pagans finally reevaluated. Once the state charged Allen, his defense team insisted that Holder and Westfall receive another look. When law enforcement re-examined Holder, he changed his story about knowing AW. Back in 2017, he told law enforcement he, quote, never actually met AW, end quote. But in August 2023, he told law enforcement he met AW once. And during a deposition in 2024, he said he met AW, quote, 2 times, twice, end quote. At least one of those encounters occurred shortly before AW's murder at Westfall's home. Oh, not the murder at the home. The visit at Westfall's home, I'm assuming. At the insistence of Allen's counsel, law enforcement finally examined Westfall's alibi on August 17, 2023. Westfall's son, who was a minor when the murders occurred, could not remember if he was home with his dad when the girls went missing. This time, law enforcement collected Westfall's phone, but he deleted the data before turning it over. On April 4, 2024, Allen's counsel deposed Case, the Liberty Landfill HR officer. It's about the time, punching out time. In February 2017, Liberty Landfill was operating 2 staggered, overlapping shifts, one from 5 a.m. to 1:30 p.m., and a second from 7 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. On the day the girls went missing, Holder was scheduled to work from 5 a.m. to 1:30 p.m., but his badge swiped out during the second shift around 2:45 p.m. Holder did not have sole custody of his badge. It's weird. His badge was on a public rack, outside of the view of cameras, and accessible to other employees, including second shift. There was no lock on the badges, and Holder's name was prominent on his badge. Quote, if somebody left when they were supposed to, but somebody else clocked that person out an hour or so later, would that be known? Answer no, end quote. When the state moved to exclude any reference to the state's investigation into third parties, the trial court held a hearing on the motion July 2024. At the hearing, Holder's wife testified that in 2018, Holder told her he, quote, had a fight, end quote, with Westfall, quote, because Westfall wanted to up from an animal slaughter to a different type of sacrifice. She also testified that Holder claimed that, quote, Westfall killed AW, end quote, quote, with others, end quote, and that she needed to keep her mouth shut about it. Okay, now we're on the summary of argument. Unconstitutional search. The trial court, this is the defense, right? Excuse me. The trial court committed reversible error by admitting evidence seized under an unconstitutional warrant and by denying Allen a Franks hearing. Detective Liggett obtained the warrant for Allen's home only by omitting and altering witness descriptions to connect Allen to Bridge Guy, and by misrepresenting that Allen admitted he wore a blue Carhartt like Bridge Guy. These misrepresentations and omissions misled the judge into believing multiple witnesses saw Allen in his car, when in fact they described someone else in a different car. Once the affidavit is corrected, there is no probable cause. Unprecedented confinement. Allen's confessions were involuntary and the product of grave mental disability caused by 13 months of maximum security pretrial solitary confinement, which exceeded IDOC policy and caused psychosis, paranoia, and confusion, while state actors were indifferent to his deterioration. Admission of these statements violated both federal due process and Indiana's protections against unnecessary rigor, and the error was not harmless, requiring suppression. Unfair trial. The trial court denied Allen his constitutional right to a fair trial through a series of arbitrary and prejudicial rulings that crippled his ability to present a complete defense. The trial court excluded critical exculpatory evidence, including Blair's sketch, which directly undermined the state's eyewitness theory and timeline, and barred expert testimony challenging the reliability of the state's forensic methodology. It permitted inadmissible hearsay to rehabilitate the prosecution's timeline, and it blocked Allen from presenting evidence that showed the circumstances that led to his confessions and impeached their credibility, including audio depicting his deteriorated mental state. The court further prevented Allen from introducing substantial evidence of third-party guilt and an incomplete investigation, depriving the jury of context necessary to assess reasonable doubt. Collectively, these errors violated Allen's 14th and 6th Amendment rights and created a fundamentally one-sided proceeding. A new trial is constitutionally required to restore the integrity of the adversarial process. So here's argument about their not having the ability to have a Franks hearing and admitting evidence seized from the unconstitutional search. So it looks like they did a motion to suppress. Let's see. It says he filed a motion to suppress. It's a little difficult to read. Filed a motion to suppress, motion for Frank's hearing, amended requests, and memorandums with exhibits. The trial court denied the motion in hearing, concluding Liggett's affidavit did not include false statements or omit facts with reckless disregard or intent to mislead. They say the trial court erred by concluding Detective Liggett did not make false statements or reckless omissions in his affidavit. So it says both the state and U.S. Constitution guarantee that, quote, no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, end quote. The state must include, quote, all material facts, end quote, right? So that's inculpatory and exculpatory, right? Facts are facts. In a warrant application, including, quote, facts that, quote, cast doubt on existence of probable cause, end quote, and a, quote, source's reliability, end quote. Like a tip. Like a tip. You guys know what I'm talking about. A warrant is invalid if, sorry, I had to cough. A warrant is invalid if, quote, 1, the police omitted facts with the intent, intentional, to make the affidavit misleading or with reckless disregard for whether it would be misleading. And 2, the affidavit supplemented with the omitted information would have been insufficient to support a find of probable cause. So they look at it, they put the information in, and they say, would that have been different? It says the defendant must prove a reckless or deliberate false statement by a preponderance. Okay, that's Franks versus Delaware. That's the Franks hearing, the case that it's based on. It says an officer omits evidence with reckless disregard if the, quote, officer withholds of facts in his, I don't know what a can is, that, quote, any reasonable person would have known that, the judge would wish to know, end quote. Examples include facts undermining the type of drug seized or an informant's reliability. Okay, they're quoting the case here. Let's see. Okay, so they're just supporting it with case law. Detective Liggett omitted and changed key information that undermined his conclusion Allen was the bridge guy. Liggett misled the court in 4 ways. First, Detective Liggett misled the court to believe Blair's description of the man on the bridge matched Allen when it did not. Liggett told the court that Blair said the man was standing on the platform and wearing a blue jacket and jeans. But Liggett omitted the rest of Blair's description that did not match Allen. The man had brown, quote, poofy, end quote, hair like the sketch below, was in his 20s or 30s, youthful and medium build. Second, Liggett misled the court that Allen's car was parked at the old CPS lot during the time of the kidnappings. Detective Liggett told the court that after Blair saw the man on the bridge, she saw 2 girls she thought were AW and LG on the trail approaching the bridge. As Blair was leaving the trail, she saw a car oddly parked at the old CPS lot. Around 2 p.m., another witness, Wilson, also saw a car backed into the CPS lot as if concealing the license plate. I back my truck in all the time. So, I don't know. Both witnesses drew diagrams of the car parked in the, quote, same general area and manner, end quote. Liggett told the court that Allen parked his black 2016 Ford Focus at the old CPS building, but omitted that Blair said the car she saw during the time frame of the kidnapping was not black. Remember, I think that was definitive. And it had sharp angles like the sketch below. This is, more of an egg shape, and this is square. Considering the omitted information, Blair excluded Allen's black hatchback, seen here. This is a material omission, and he's going to cite U.S. versus Wells. Third, Liggett misled the court that the man walking on 300 North was Bridge Guy. Liggett falsely told the court that Carbaugh in 2017 claimed the man was muddy and bloody, wearing a blue jacket, when she actually said his jacket was tan and he was muddy. A bloody man in a blue jacket matches Bridge Guy. A muddy tan man in a muddy man. God, sorry guys. A muddy man. Say that 10 times fast. A muddy man in a tan jacket does not. Look at the, what is it, the alliteration? A bloody man in a blue, bloody in blue, and muddy man in tan. Liggett also admitted that Blair told him the man she saw on the bridge was not the same person Carbaugh described. Okay, remember that? We got that. Idaho State Police even released a public statement that the men are, quote, are not the same person, end quote. Okay, so we heard that before. Fourth, Liggett connected Allen to the Bridge Guy by falsely claiming Allen admitted wearing a black or blue Carhartt and a head covering. Parentheses, the man the 4 girls saw wore the same clothes as the man on LG's phone. Parentheses, the clothes Allen admitted he wore, quote, matched the clothes by the individual on the bridge in the photo taken from the video from LG's phone, end quote, end parentheses. But Allen told investigators he didn't know what he was wearing. Although Liggett used Allen's wife's statement that Allen currently owned a blue Carhartt as nexus to his home, Liggett omitted that she said he purchased the coat, quote, a couple of years ago, end quote. The girls were killed in 2017. Had the court known Allen simply admitted owning a blue or black coat, as does probably every 50-year-old man, it would have known there is no connection between him and Bridge Guy. 2. Detective Liggett's omissions and false statements recklessly misled the judge. Any reasonable person would have known the judge would wish to know that, 1, Blair's description of Bridge Guy and the car at CPS did not match Allen or his car. 2, in 2017, Carbaugh described the man walking down the road as only, quote, muddy, end quote, wearing a, quote, tan, end quote, jacket, and not a, quote, blue jacket, end quote, like Bridge Guy. 3, Blair did not believe she saw the same man as Carbaugh saw. 4, Allen never said he wore a blue Carhartt or head covering, parentheses, like Bridge Guy, end paren, and he bought his blue Carhartt a couple of years before 2022. A couple, which is 2. The omitted and false information strikes at the heart of Liggett's conclusion that Allen was the man on LG's phone. The state's probable cause relies on a tight timeline, making Allen the man the 4 girls saw on the trail, Blair saw on the bridge, and Carbaugh saw on the road. Any judge would want to know if witnesses described someone other than Allen, his car, or Bridge Guy. Moreover, the fact that Liggett lied twice in the affidavit about the connection between Allen and Bridge Guy, i.e. the blue jacket, shows more than reckless disregard for the truth, right? So when they're going to argue these to get this suppressed, there has to be like an innocent factor, like they didn't mean to do it or whatever. So this is why they're pushing on the reckless disregard for the truth. These falsehoods were directed at connecting Allen to LG's video, which would otherwise include any white male. With the omitted and inaccurate evidence, the affidavit was insufficient to establish probable cause. Probable cause exists where there is sufficient evidence to cause a reasonably prudent person to believe a search will uncover evidence of a crime. A reasonably prudent person would not believe Allen was connected to the murders or that evidence would be found in his home. The state is left with Dolan's report, spelled differently now, claiming Allen told him he's on the trails between 1:30 and 3:30 p.m. and saw 3 girls, not 4 girls, like those who thought they saw the Bridge Guy. So that those would have been the other girls. Or not those girls, I'm not sure. Okay, because we've got the 2 girls, the victims, and then we've got Allen who saw 3 girls, and then there were 4 girls that supposedly saw one of the Bridge Guys, whatever, okay? During his October 13, 2022 interview, Allen admitted wearing blue jeans and owning a gun, knives, and a blue or black jacket and walking out to the first platform of the bridge to watch fish. But Allen doesn't look anything like the person Blair saw on the bridge. Also, his car is a different color and shape than the oddly parked car. And the man car boss saw walking was mostly likely not even bridge guy. If Allen being on the trail within the same 2 hours the girls were abducted is enough for a warrant, law enforcement would have obtained one for Allen's home in 2017. In 2022, ISP had no more evidence connecting Allen to the murders than they had the days after the murders, when Allen, like others, responded to their request for help. It was not enough then, and it was not enough in 2022. The error requires reversal. A court must suppress the fruits of an illegal search. The state's entire case is built on Liggett's half-truths and falsehoods. Strong language. Without the gun seized in the search, there is no opinion from Oberg upon which the state arrested Allen. Okay, so they're using that connection. And without the arrest, there are no confessions. If the warrant was illegal, the state has no case. Even if this court finds the confession was not a product of solitary, Allen is still entitled to a new trial. Before a, quote, constitutional error can be held harmless, the court must find it was harmless beyond a reasonable doubt, end quote. Without the fruits of the search, the gun, a casing in a hope box, the Carhartt knives, and computer, the state cannot prove the jury would have convicted. At minimum, Allen is entitled to a remand for a Franks hearing. Even if Allen's exhibits to the Franks motion did not prove by a preponderance that Liggett deliberately or recklessly falsified or omitted material information, they entitled him to a hearing. A defendant who makes a, quote, substantial preliminary, end quote, showing that an affidavit included a false statement or reckless omission necessary to probable cause is constitutionally entitled to challenge the warrant at a hearing, as outlined in Bunnell v. State. Franks. To meet this showing, the defendant need not present conclusive proof, but must support their accusations with evidence and citations to the warrant application. They're saying here the denial of the hearing was legally erroneous because Allen made a substantial showing. So they're saying that, he proved it. He supported his claims with depositions, police interviews, and reports. Citing his application, he made specific arguments. In a final motion, he reiterated the points, urging the court to compare the affidavit with Blair's and Carbaugh's interviews. Tellingly, the trial court was willing to schedule a Franks hearing when Allen was represented by Fort Wayne attorneys, but refused when original attorneys were reinstated. That's interesting. Allen's constitutional protections are not contingent on who his attorneys are. That's weird. Okay. The trial court erred by admitting statements Allen made while gravely disabled during his unprecedented pretrial solitary confinement in a maximum security prison. Quote, I found solitary confinement the most forbidding aspect of prison life. There is no end and no beginning. There is only one's mind, which can begin to play tricks. Was that a dream or did it really happen? One begins to question everything. End quote. By Nelson Mandela. Solitary confinement is a form of punishment, and depending upon its conditions, even torture. By 2023, when Allen was held in solitary for 13 months, it was well established that prolonged isolation causes psychological pain, suicidal ideation, and psychosis. To protect inmates from psychological harm, the IDOC strictly prohibits solitary confinement over 30 days for anyone with serious mental illness, SMI, and requires transfer if SMI symptoms appear. When Allen exhibited the predictable symptoms of psychological pain, confusion, and psychosis, IDOC administrators refused to transfer him to a mental health unit. When Allen's attorneys informed the court of his dire condition, the court also refused to move him, and the prosecutor delayed and mocked counsel's concerns while collecting evidence of Allen's confessions. The question for this court is unprecedented but simple. Should the state be able to benefit from Allen's psychological pain that their deliberate indifference to his mental health caused? Human decency provides the answer, no. Standard of review and additional facts. An appellate court reviews a suppression denial for, quote, substantial evidence of probative value that supports the trial court's decision, end quote, citing Renzulli. It considers uncontradicted evidence favorable to the defendant and reviews legal issues de novo. Let's go into these citations. It says, Allen moved to suppress his statements while made in solitary confinement, which the court denied. The court reasoned that the statements were voluntary because Allen failed to show they resulted from state psychological coercion or coercive interrogation. The court found Allen's detention was intended to protect him, and that while he suffered from major depressive disorder and anxiety, he did not have SMI that would render his statements involuntary. In addition to IDOC records and videos like those admitted at trial, Allen proffered an order in settlement from Indiana Protection and Advocacy, IPAS versus IDOC, that the trial court excluded from the suppression hearing as irrelevant. So it looks like maybe they filed something and won. I'm not sure, because it talks about order and settlement. In 2011, Southern District of Indiana held that IDOC's housing of SMI inmates in solitary constituted cruel and unusual punishment, violating the Eighth Amendment. The Southern District found SMI includes delusional disorder, psychotic disorder, and MDD. Segregation is, quote, segregation is harmful to prisoners with SMI, end quote, due to lack of social interaction, significant sensory deprivation, and forced idleness, leading to, quote, decompensation, end quote, and, quote, psychological pain, end quote. An inmate decompensating from solitary may experience, quote, hallucinations, sleep disturbance, memory problems, anxiety, paranoia, depression, eating problems, or engaging in self-injury or suicide, end quote. Suicide watch further exacerbates the illness. Quote, the severe conditions in the segregation units cause a predictable deterioration, end quote, of SMI prisoners' mental health, and the, quote, IDOC has explicitly observed, diagnosed, and noted patient decompensation, end quote. The IDOC knew these effects occurred even in non-SMI offenders. Before a hearing on relief, the parties reached a settlement including a, quote, expanded, end quote, definition of SMI that, quote, subsumed, end quote, the court's definition. I don't know what subsumed mean, but they expanded because before they only talked about what SMI included. So it looks like they expanded it. They say that IDOC's policies refer to the settlement that an inmate with SMI can only be held in solitary 30 days. If an inmate decompensates into SMI and is unlikely to return to general population within 30 days, transfer is required. Allen admitted Dr. Westcott's 127-page report. On August 21st, 2023, Westcott evaluated Allen, who had been in WCU over 9 months. He was, quote, terrified, unquote, unsure what was real, and wondering if he was dead in hell or waiting for heaven. He could not recall weeks of early 2023, including playing with feces, confessing, or banging his head. He believed he had been drugged. Westcott cited IDOC records showing, quote, acute periods of confusion, paranoia, delusional thinking, cognitive slowing, aggression, and combativeness, end quote. During this period of loss of, quote, touch with reality, end quote, Allen confessed. Westcott concluded Allen's psychosis stemmed from MDD, his personality, and the well-known effects of solitary confinement. Allen was, quote, grossly disorganized, delusional, and paranoid, end quote. Objective testing ruled out malingering. The trial court abused its discretion by refusing to admit the IPAS order settlement into the suppression hearing. Evidence is relevant if it has, quote, any tendency to make fact of consequence in determining the action, end quote, more or less probable than it would be without it. Here, the order settlement makes it more likely Allen's psychosis was caused by his confinement. The order found solitary confinement causes all the symptoms Allen experienced. Allen was more likely to decompensate because he spent 7 months on suicide watch, an even more restrictive form of solitary. The order settlement also makes it more likely Allen was subjected to psychological coercion by showing solitary causes, quote, psychological pain, end quote. It demonstrates state action, the IDOC placing and keeping Allen in solitary, knowing it was causing this, quote, predictable, end quote, pain. The order settlement shows how extensively IDOC violated its own policy as it includes MDD in the SMI definition. restricting Allen's solitary to 30 days. Allen was harmed by the court's refusal to consider the order's settlement because it undermined the court's findings and conclusions. The state failed to prove Allen's statements made while gravely disabled were voluntary. U.S. Constitution. The state failed to prove that Allen's statements were not a product of psychological coercion. An involuntary statement obtained through, quote, state action, end quote, violates due process and is inadmissible. All right. Now, I think what they're saying here, or attempting to say, not in this exact fashion, is, you've seen the things, I don't know, the jokes or the whatever, the beating with the phone books and stuff. Like, they're going to beat it out of you. They're going to coerce it out of you somehow, right? That type of vernacular. Well, I think that's where they're going here, that it wasn't a phone book per se, but it was the jail cell and the solitary and all that. But that was the phone book. I'm assuming that's where it's going, okay? A confession is voluntary if it is a product of rational intellect and freely self-determined rather than overborne will by state law enforcement conduct. State law enforcement can include psychiatric facilities and prison staff. Statements produced through a coercive environment are involuntary, regardless of whether solicited through police interrogation. This is from that case citation, Connolly. When state actors use more, quote, subtle forms of psychological coercion, end quote, the defendant's mental illness is more significant in the voluntariness determination. But the state must still exploit the defendant's illness with coercive tactics. This is generally done through aggressive interrogation, goodness, folks, sorry. But exploitation can occur in other ways. So they're talking about this as a method, I guess. For a statement to be voluntary, the state action must be, quote, causally related to the confession, end quote. The state's prolonged solitary confinement of Allen was state action, because done by the state. Contrary to the court's finding that Allen failed to provide, quote, state psychological coercion, end quote, it was the state's burden to prove Allen's statement voluntary by a preponderance of the evidence. To the extent Allen had a minimal burden of production, he met that. Prolonged maximum security solitary confinement of a pretrial detainee, especially after psychosis develops, is state action. Unlike the mentally ill defendant in Connolly, who walked into a police station and confessed, Allen never voluntarily came into custody. He consistently protested innocence until enduring 5 months of maximum security solitary with no human contact except while chained or caged. Because it was pre-trial, Allen's solitary was unprecedented and borderline, if not unconstitutional, punishment. They're citing some case sites here. Other IDOC safekeepers were in mental health units, not solitary. They also say it exceeded the 30-day IDOC policy restriction, knowing it could cause harm, and once they observed his predictable deterioration, they refused to transfer him, right? So they're saying they have a 30-day policy because it causes harm. Okay? So they knew, this is the defense saying they observed the predictable deterioration, 30 days or less or otherwise, right? But they still refused to transfer him. So they're saying that they keeping him in solitary when he was, quote, no doubt, end quote, SMI, seriously mentally ill, was an administrative, not clinical decision. Finally, the state's conduct also involved the prosecutor, law enforcement, and the court. After Allen filed his April 5th emergency transfer motion, citing his dire condition, the prosecutor waited 9 days to respond while investigators monitored real-time calls in which Allen confessed. So they're saying he was exhibiting this. They should have moved him, but no, they waited. And then the coercion, right? The facility, the coercion, the solitary evoked the response. The phone book evoked the response. That's what they're alleging here, it sounds like to me. During this delay, Allen continued deteriorating. The prosecutor then mocked defense concerns as, quote, colorful, end quote, dramatic, end quote. While the same day, IDOC found Allen gravely, quote, gravely disabled, end quote. Knowing Allen was decompensating, the court refused to transfer him, putting the onus on IDOC to provide care. It is fundamentally wrong to keep a gravely disabled Allen in solitary while using against him statements made to psychologists and suicide companions. Sneeze. 1 week later, the prosecutor sought all medical records, videos, and communications while confessions were ongoing. Monitoring and collecting his statements consumed hundreds of hours and produced over 60 confessions. ISP interviewed inmates and guards and even sent a psychologist to speak with Dr. Walla. Allen showed more than sufficient state action. Okay, we're going to stop here and we're going to move on to the next one. Thank you for being here. Hopefully it's helpful. Hopefully it's interesting. If so, I'd love for you to like, subscribe, or share, and comment below. Let me know what you think. All right, I'll see you on the next one.